It was never supposed to be real, just a deal, a desperate arrangement to save a dying ranch, a woman with no way out, and a drifter with nothing to lose. No promises, no love, just survival. But sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't hatred. It's what grows in silence between two people forced to stand side by side. And when the world tries to tear them apart, what begins as a lie can become something unbreakable.
The sound of dry dirt hitting a cheap pine coffin has always sounded like opportunity to me. Most men in Oak Haven hear grief in that hollow thud. Some hear the inevitable march of time. But as I stood beneath the unforgiving Texas sun, watching the gravediggers bury old Thomas Sterling, all I heard was the satisfying turn of a page in my bank's ledger. I stood a polite distance from the graveside, leaning on my silver-tipped cane, playing the role of the respectful community pillar. The wind kicked up dust that coated the black wool of my suit, but I didn't mind. Today was a day of quiet victory. My eyes, however, were not on the descending box. They were fixed on the woman standing at the edge of the pit. Clara Sterling. She wore a faded black mourning dress that had likely belonged to her mother, the hem frayed from dragging across the unforgiving earth of her beloved ranch. She didn't weep. Not a single tear slipped down her pale, sun-kissed face. Her spine was a line of rigid iron, her chin tilted upward in that infuriatingly proud way that had always made my blood run hot with the desire to break her. Old Thomas had been a fool, clinging to 300 acres of prime riverfront property with the stubbornness of a dying mule. But a man's pride cannot pay his debts. Over the past 3 years, I had quietly, systematically bought up every promissory note and outstanding loan attached to the Sterling name. I had tightened the noose slowly, so slowly the old man barely felt himself suffocating until his heart simply gave out. And now the trap was fully sprung. Texas law, bless its archaic patriarchal heart, was very clear on the matter of property and debt. A single woman could not inherit a heavily mortgaged estate without a male co-signatory to assume the financial burden. Without a husband, Clara had exactly 30 days to settle the debt in full, or the county would auction the land. And I, as the primary creditor, would acquire the Sterling Ranch for a fraction of its true worth. But I didn't just want the land. I wanted her. I wanted Clara Sterling to walk into my office, strip away that arrogant pride, and realize that her only salvation lay in marrying the very man who held her ruin in his hands. I wanted to see the exact moment the fight drained out of those sharp amber eyes. After the funeral, I didn't offer my condolences. I simply tipped my hat to her and walked back to the Oak Haven Bank. For the next 4 hours, I sat in my plush leather chair behind my mahogany desk, pouring myself a glass of imported bourbon. The air in my office was cool, insulated from the sweltering misery of the town outside. I left the heavy oak door slightly ajar. I knew her route. She would have to go to the county registry office first to hear the bad news from the clerk. Then reality would set in. Then she would come to me. I took a slow sip of the amber liquid, savoring the burn, mentally rehearsing the benevolent, slightly reluctant tone I would use when I offered her my hand in marriage. A purely practical arrangement, my dear Clara, to save your father's legacy. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked. 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. At 4:15, heavy boots echoed in the corridor. But it wasn't the light, determined tread of a desperate woman. It was the lumbering gait of Miller, one of the men I kept on the payroll for tasks that required muscle rather than intellect. Miller appeared in the doorway, taking off his sweat-stained hat, looking distinctly uncomfortable. "Well?" I demanded, setting my glass down. "Is she waiting in the lobby?" "No, Mr. Royce," Miller mumbled, shifting his weight. "Miss Sterling ain't here." I frowned, a flicker of irritation disrupting my perfect afternoon. "Did she go to the registry office?" "Yes, sir. Walked right in." "And? Did the clerk tell her about the 30-day clause?" "He did. I was standing outside the open window, heard the whole thing. He told her she needed a husband's signature or the bank takes it all." I smiled, my irritation fading. "And she wept, I presume?" "No, sir," Miller said, scratching his bearded jaw. "That's the strange part. She didn't cry at all. She just nodded, thanked the clerk, and walked right back out. And where did she go, Miller? If she didn't come here, did she ride back to her empty house to sulk? Miller swallowed hard. No, Mr. Royce. She walked straight down Main Street past the bank and went into the lumber yard. She went to see that drifter, the quiet one who's been chopping wood for old man Higgins. My fingers tightened around the armrests of my chair. Silas Vance, a nobody, a ragged shadow of a man who had drifted into Oakhaven a few months ago, speaking to no one, sleeping in the livery loft and working for pennies. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. The sound startled Miller. The lumber yard? I chuckled, picking up my bourbon again. She thinks she can hire a day laborer to fix her fences and somehow dig up $500 in a month? The poor delusional girl. With respect, boss, Miller hesitated. She didn't look like she was hiring him to fix fences. They talked for a long time, serious-like. I waved a hand dismissively, feeling a profound sense of amusement wash over me. Clara was cornered, thrashing blindly in the net. She was looking for a temporary fix, a shield to hide behind. Perhaps she even thought she could convince the drifter to sign a fraudulent paper. It didn't matter. It was a pathetic, frantic move of a dying chess piece. Let her play her little games, Miller, I said, my voice smooth and confident. Let her drag that stray dog into her mess. It changes nothing. A stray dog runs at the first sign of a raised stick. I looked out the window of my office toward the dusty street, a cold smile stretching across my face. She wanted to pretend she had a way out. She wanted to play a desperate game of make-believe. Fine. I would let her set the stage. And when her little charade collapsed, the fall would break her completely. 30 days, Clara, I thought, raising my glass to the empty room. The clock is ticking. It took exactly 4 days for the absurdity of the situation to reach my desk. 4 days of suffocating windless Texas heat, during which I had comfortably assumed Clara Sterling was sitting in her dilapidated farmhouse, staring at the peeling wallpaper and realizing the absolute futility of her existence. I had expected her to arrive at the bank by Friday at the latest, her shoulders bowed, her amber eyes downcast, ready to surrender the deed and herself to my entirely reasonable terms. Instead, it was Friday morning when Miller burst into my office, his heavy boots scuffing the polished hardwood floors I had paid a small fortune to have imported from New Orleans. He was panting, his face red beneath the brim of his sweat-stained hat, looking as though he had run all the way from the edge of town. "Mr. Royce," he gasped, leaning against the doorframe, "you better come down to the First Methodist right now." I did not look up from the ledger I was reviewing. I am not a religious man on Sundays, Miller. I am certainly not one on a Friday morning. If the Reverend needs a loan for a new bell, he can make an appointment. "It ain't the Reverend, boss," Miller said, swallowing loudly. "It's the Sterling girl. She's getting hitched." My gold-nibbed pen paused a millimeter above the parchment. A drop of black ink gathered at the tip, swelled, and fell, blotting a perfectly good column of figures. Slowly, I set the pen down. "Repeat that, Miller. Eat carefully." "She's marrying the drifter, Silas Vance, right now. Judge Higgins is officiating in the vestry." For a long, suspended moment, the only sound in the room was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock. Then a low chuckle rumbled in my chest, bubbling up until it escaped as a sharp, genuine laugh that echoed off the mahogany-paneled walls. "She's actually going through with it," I murmured, more to myself than to my dim-witted enforcer. I thought it was a desperate bluff, a threat she hoped would reach my ears and force me to negotiate the debt. But she's actually dragging that stray dog to the altar. "What do we do, boss? Should I go bust it up?" "Bust it up?" I rose from my chair, taking my silver-tipped cane from the corner. "Heavens, no, Miller. Why would we interrupt such a touching display of human desperation? No. We are going to go and offer our warmest congratulations." The walk to the First Methodist Church was a study in Oakhaven's inherent squalor. The wooden boardwalks groaned under my boots. The morning sun was already baking the dust in the streets, turning the air into a shimmering, oppressive haze. Townspeople tipped their hats and quickly averted their eyes as I passed. They knew who held the mortgages on their feed stores, their liveries, their pathetic little homesteads. I was the blood that pumped through this town's dusty veins. When I reached the small, whitewashed church at the end of Elm Street, I didn't bother to knock. I pushed the heavy oak doors open with the tip of my cane. The hinges shrieked, announcing my arrival to the empty pews. They were standing near the altar. Just the three of them. Judge Higgins looking nervous and sweating through his collar. Clara wearing the same faded black mourning dress she had worn to her father's funeral. And the man, Silas Vance. They paused and turned to look at me. The silence in the cavernous room was heavy, smelling of old wax, dry timber, and impending ruin. "Don't mind me, Judge," I called out, my voice smooth and loud, echoing off the rafters. I walked slowly down the center aisle, my cane striking the floorboards in a steady, measured rhythm. Thwack, step, thwack, step. I merely heard there was a joyous union taking place. As the primary benefactor of the Sterling estate, I felt it was my duty to bear witness. Clara's jaw tightened. She looked exceptionally beautiful in her anger, her spine stiff, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked like a queen about to be led to the guillotine, refusing to grant the executioner the satisfaction of a tremor. But my attention quickly shifted from the stubborn girl to the man standing beside her. Up close, Silas Vance was utterly unremarkable in the way that all men who work themselves to death for pennies are. He was tall, yes, perhaps an inch or two taller than my own 6 feet, but he wore a faded, dust-beaten shirt that hung off his broad shoulders, and dark trousers that had seen better years. His hair was a dark, unruly mess, and a faint silver scar cut through the stubble on the left side of his jaw. He looked exactly like what he was, a piece of cheap driftwood that had washed up in Oakhaven, ready to be burned for warmth. "Mr. Royce," Clara said, her voice remarkably steady. "This is a private matter." "Nothing is private when it concerns the bank's investments, my dear," I smiled, stopping a few feet from the altar. I looked at the drifter. "And you must be Mr. Vance." "I am Harlan Royce. I own just about everything your lovely bride is currently standing on." Vance didn't offer his hand. He didn't even shift his weight. He just looked at me. "Continue, Judge," Vance said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely carried past the altar rails. He didn't look at the judge. His eyes remained fixed on me. Judge Higgins cleared his throat, his eyes darting between me and the drifter. "Right. Well, do you, Silas Vance, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." The answer was flat, devoid of emotion. "A business transaction confirmed." "And do you, Clara Sterling, take this man?" I watched Clara swallow hard. I saw the fractional hesitation, the moment where her pride warred with her reality. I smiled, letting her see my amusement. "Go on," I thought. "Say it. Tie your sinking ship to this piece of scrap wood." "I do," she whispered. "Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Texas, I pronounce you man and wife. You may exchange tokens." Vance reached into his pocket. I expected him to pull out nothing, or perhaps a ring made of twisted horsehair. Instead, he produced a small, dull band of copper. It looked like a piece of pipe he had sawed off and polished as best he could. He took Clara's left hand. I saw her fingers tremble just slightly as his large, calloused, scarred hands engulfed hers. He slid the cheap copper ring onto her finger. It was a pathetic sight, a mockery of the institution of marriage. They agreed it was only pretend, I reminded myself. She was buying time. He was likely buying a roof over his head and a few decent meals before the pressure got too high. "Beautiful," I drawled, slow clapping 3 times. The sound was stark and mocking in the quiet church. Truly a romance for the ages. The Princess and the Pauper. I am moved to tears. Clara turned to me, her eyes flashing with a hatred so pure it was almost intoxicating. "The deed requires a husband's signature, Mr. Royce. I have one. You will have your revised paperwork on your desk by noon. The auction is cancelled." "Indeed it is, Mrs. Vance," I said, putting a cruel emphasis on her new low-born name. "You have bought yourself a reprieve, but let us not play games. A debt of $500 is due before the first frost. And forgive me for pointing out the obvious, but your husband doesn't look like a man who has $5 to his name, let alone 500. I stepped closer, ignoring Clara, and focused entirely on Vance. I wanted to see the intimidation set in. I wanted to see the realization dawn on him that he had just stepped into a war he could not possibly win. "You see, Mr. Vance," I said softly, "Oak Haven is an unforgiving place for strangers. The land is hard. The work is harder. And the men to whom debts are owed are the hardest of all. I give you a week before the reality of this girl's ruined farm breaks your back, and you slip out the back door in the dead of night, just like every other drifter who realizes he bit off more than he could chew." I waited for him to look away. I waited for the nervous swallow, the shift of the eyes, the subtle shrinking of posture that every lesser man displayed when I backed them into a corner. Silas Vance did none of those things. He slowly let go of Clara's hand. He turned to face me fully. His eyes were not brown, as I had initially thought, but a strange, dark slate gray, like the sky just before a tornado touches down. There was no fear in them. There was no anger either. There was just an absolute, freezing stillness. It was the look of a man who was looking at an obstacle, calculating the precise amount of force required to remove it, and realizing it wouldn't take much effort at all. "Noon," Vance said. His voice was quiet, but it seemed to vibrate against my breastbone. "The papers will be on your desk. Have your pen ready, Royce." He didn't wait for my response. He put a hand on the small of Clara's back, a proprietary protective gesture that made my teeth grind together, and guided her past me, down the aisle, and out into the blinding Texas sun. I stood alone in the church, the echo of his voice still hanging in the stale air. A prickle of unease washed over the back of my neck, cold and sudden. I tapped my cane against the floor, shaking off the absurd sensation. He was a nobody. A pawn, and pawns, eventually, are always sacrificed. "A week," I muttered to the empty pews. "He won't last a week." I am a man of ledgers. I believe that human behavior, much like mathematics, is entirely predictable if you understand the variables. Give a man enough pressure, he will fold. Give a woman enough despair, she will submit. The variable of Silas Vance was supposed to be simple, a transient laborer motivated by a temporary bed and free meals. The script I had written in my mind dictated that he would quickly tire of the grueling labor required to keep the Sterling Ranch from sinking into the earth. I anticipated arguments. I anticipated the loud, ugly fracturing of a fake marriage born of convenience. By the 8th day, the script had caught fire and burned to ash. I was sitting in my office, tapping a cigar against a crystal ashtray, listening to Miller deliver his morning report. I had assigned Miller and another one of my boys, a weasel named Higgins, to keep a constant, subtle watch on the Sterling property. "Nothing, boss," Miller said, looking miserable. He knew I despised the word nothing. Not a shout, not a thrown plate, nothing. "Are you telling me they are living in perfect marital bliss, Miller?" I asked, my voice dripping with venomous sarcasm. "Are they holding hands and singing hymns on the porch?" "No, sir, they barely talk. At least not that we can hear, but—" "Well, the drifter ain't acting like a man looking to skip town." Miller pulled a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket, squinting at his own atrocious handwriting. "He's up at 4 every morning. By lantern light, boss. Monday, he rebuilt the entire western corral fence. Sunk the posts deep. Tuesday, he spent 14 hours clearing the deadwood out of the lower creek bed. Yesterday, I watched him haul 50-pound sacks of grain from the depot without taking a break. He works like a damn machine." I clamped down hard on my cigar. "And Clara?" She works right alongside him, or near him. But here's the thing. Miller hesitated, looking genuinely perplexed. He doesn't let her do the heavy lifting anymore. I saw her trying to carry a water barrel. He just walked over, didn't say a word, took it right out of her hands and carried it to the barn. So? He possesses basic, primitive chivalry. What does that prove? It proves he ain't lazy, Mr. Royce. And he ain't acting like a man who's just passing through. I dismissed Miller with a sharp wave of my hand, irritation crawling beneath my skin like a rash. This was unacceptable. The pressure wasn't working. If Vance actually managed to make the farm productive, if they somehow scraped together the $500 before the first frost, no, I wouldn't allow it. I needed to see it for myself. I needed to find the crack in their little charade and drive a wedge into it until the whole structure collapsed. Later that afternoon, the opportunity presented itself in the center of town. I was standing on the shaded balcony of the bank, smoking, when I saw Clara's wagon pull up to the general store. She climbed down, looking exhausted but resolute, her copper ring catching a glint of the brutal sunlight. Vance was not with her. He was across the street at the blacksmith, loading heavy iron tools into a burlap sack. I watched as a man stumbled out of the saloon next to the general store. It was Cletus, a local drunkard who owed me more money than his life was worth. He was a mean, ugly brute when he had whiskey in him, which was always. Cletus saw Clara. He staggered toward her, blocking her path to the store's entrance. I leaned over the balcony railing, a cruel smile forming. This would be educational. Let Clara see how little her husband could protect her in a town owned by me and populated by wolves. Well, if it ain't the newlywed, Cletus slurred, tipping his greasy hat back. Looking mighty fine, Mrs. Vance, though I reckon that drifter ain't got the coin to buy you a proper wedding dress. Tell you what, give me a little kiss, and I'll buy you a ribbon. Clara took a step back, her spine stiffening. Step aside, Cletus. You're drunk. Come on now, don't be high and mighty, Cletus sneered, reaching out and grabbing her wrist. His thick, filthy fingers dug into her pale skin. Clara gasped, trying to yank her arm away, but the drunk was massive. I looked across the street to see if Vance had noticed. He wasn't there. I blinked. The spot by the blacksmith was empty. The burlap sack of iron tools sat abandoned in the dirt. A shadow moved across the boardwalk with terrifying speed. I didn't even hear his boots. Suddenly, Silas Vance was just there. He didn't shout. He didn't puff out his chest or make a grand display. He simply reached out and clamped his large, scarred hand over Cletus's thick forearm, the one holding Clara. I watched from above as Vance's knuckles turned white. Cletus let out a sharp, sudden yelp of agony. His knees buckled instantly as the pressure on his radial nerve became unbearable. He dropped Clara's wrist, his face contorting in pain. Vance didn't let go. He stepped into Cletus's space, crowding the larger man, looking down at him with those dead, slate-gray eyes. "If you ever touch her again," Vance whispered. The street was quiet enough that the words floated up to my balcony, chilling the sweat on my neck. "I will take your arm off at the shoulder, and I will beat you to death with it. Do we understand each other?" Cletus, pale and sweating, nodded frantically. Vance released him, shoving him backward into the dust. Cletus scrambled away like a whipped cur, cradling his bruised arm. Vance turned to Clara. His posture changed instantly. The lethal stillness vanished, replaced by something I had never seen in a man of his station. Absolute, focused tenderness. He looked at her wrist, where red marks were already forming. He didn't touch her without permission. He hovered his hands near hers, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would crack. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. "No," she breathed, looking up at him. And in that look, I saw the catastrophic failure of my plan. She wasn't looking at a hired hand. She wasn't looking at a fake husband. She was looking at a shield, at a protector. Vance finally looked up, and his eyes locked directly onto mine, up on the balcony. He knew I was watching. He knew I had let it happen. His stare promised violence, not the wild violence of a barroom brawl, but the cold, systematic violence of an executioner. I turned and walked back into my office, slamming the door. My heart was beating a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I poured a heavy measure of bourbon, my hands shaking slightly. This is absurd, I told myself. He is a drifter. He is nothing. But my mind couldn't unsee the brutal efficiency of his movement or the way Clara had looked at him. The next day, driven by an obsessive need to reassert my dominance, I ordered my horse saddled. I rode out to the Sterling property. I needed to remind them whose land they were standing on. I needed to cast a shadow over their little domestic fantasy. The ranch sat in a slight depression near the dried-up creek bed, baking under the midday sun. As I rode past the dilapidated gates, I heard the frantic, violent sound of hooves kicking against heavy timber. I tied my horse to a post and walked quietly toward the main corral. Inside the dusty ring was a massive, pitch-black stallion. I knew the horse. Old Thomas Sterling had bought him 2 years ago, a wild, unbroken devil named Midnight. The beast had thrown 3 hired hands and nearly trampled Thomas himself. It was a useless, vicious animal. Silas Vance was inside the corral with him. Vance was stripped to his undershirt, his skin slick with sweat and coated in fine red dust. He held a lead rope, not tight, but with a terrifyingly calm slackness. The stallion reared, thrashing its heavy hooves through the air, screaming its defiance. Any normal man would have backed away. Vance stepped forward. He didn't use a whip. He didn't shout. He moved with the stallion, mirroring its chaotic energy with a grounded, unshakable weight. He spoke to the beast in a low, continuous rumble. Every time the horse tried to bolt, Vance used his own body weight to anchor the rope, muscles straining, his boots digging trenches in the dirt, absorbing the animal's fury without returning it. It was a battle of wills, pure and primal. And I stood frozen in the shade of the barn, watching a man do something I fundamentally believed was impossible. He was breaking a wild thing, not by crushing its spirit, but by proving he could not be moved. After what felt like an hour, the stallion stopped thrashing. It stood trembling, covered in white lather, chest heaving. Vance stood perfectly still. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, he reached out his hand. The horse snorted, tossed its head, and then, miraculously, lowered its massive muzzle, pressing it into Vance's scarred palm. Vance closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the beast. "You're a stubborn bastard," Vance whispered to the horse. "But you're ours now." Ours. The word hit me like a physical blow. The screen door of the farmhouse whined open. Clara walked out, carrying a tin water canteen and a clean towel. She didn't look tired. She looked radiant, despite the dirt on her apron and the sweat on her brow. She walked up to the fence. Vance left the horse and walked toward her. He didn't say anything as he took the towel from her, wiping the grime from his face and neck. He took the canteen. Their fingers brushed. It wasn't a grand, dramatic touch. It was the casual, intimate friction of 2 people who had memorized the space between them. Vance drank deeply, then handed the canteen back. As Clara took it, she didn't look away from him. She reached up, a completely unconscious gesture, and brushed a stray lock of dark, sweat-dampened hair off his forehead. Vance leaned into the touch, just for a fraction of a second. A massive, dangerous man allowing himself to be entirely vulnerable to the gentle touch of a woman's hand. I stepped back, pressing myself flat against the rough wood of the barn, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. They had signed a piece of paper. They had agreed it was a business transaction to save the land. They had agreed it was pretend. But as I watched Silas Vance look at Clara Sterling like she was the only water source in 1,000 miles of desert, I realized the fatal flaw in my flawless trap. I had given her a desperate way out. But nobody had warned her, and more importantly, nobody had warned me, that the man she chose would forget how to stop pretending. He wasn't playing a part. He was building a kingdom. And I had just realized I was standing in his territory. There is an elegant simplicity to violence, provided one does not have to soil one's own hands to enact it. I have always viewed brute force as a crude but necessary currency. When diplomacy fails, when financial pressure is met with stubborn resilience, one must occasionally remind the lower classes of the natural order of things. By the end of the second week of Clara Sterling's absurd farce of a marriage, my patience had entirely evaporated. The drifter, Silas Vance, was not breaking. Worse, he was thriving. Reports reached me daily of fences mended, roofs patched, and livestock corralled. He was pouring a terrifying, relentless energy into that dying patch of dirt. He was becoming a fixture. It was time to introduce a new variable. I sat in the shadowed corner booth of the Brass Horn, Oakhaven's most disreputable saloon, a glass of top-shelf bourbon warming in my hand. The piano player was hammering out a discordant tune, trying to drown out the low murmur of drunks and gamblers. I checked my gold pocket watch. 10 minutes past 9. Earlier that evening, I had hired 3 men, Pike, Galt, and O'Banion. They were not men of intellect. They were mountains of scarred flesh and bad temper who made a living breaking horses and occasionally breaking men. The instructions I had given them were remarkably simple. Vance had gone to the edge of town to negotiate the purchase of winter feed. On his walk back to the Sterling farm under the cover of darkness, they were to intercept him. They were to beat him until he could no longer hold a hammer. And then they were to force his bloody hand to sign the paper currently resting on the table in front of me, a formal declaration of marital abandonment and annulment. Once the drifter was run out of town, broken and humiliated, Clara would have no shield left. I took a slow sip of bourbon, a satisfied smile playing on my lips. I imagined Vance begging in the dirt. I imagined the look on Clara's face when she woke up alone, her husband having fled like a beaten dog. Suddenly, the saloon doors didn't just open, they exploded inward. The heavy wooden louvers shattered off their hinges with the force of a cannon blast, sending splinters flying into the smoky air. The discordant piano music stopped instantly. Every head in the bar snapped toward the entrance. A body was hurled through the doorway. It hit the floorboards with a sickening crunch of bone, sliding through the sawdust until it crashed into the brass rail of the bar. It was Galt. His nose was flattened into his face, leaking a steady stream of crimson, and his left arm was bent at an angle that defied human anatomy. He groaned, a wet, pathetic sound, and did not move again. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. I sat frozen, my bourbon halfway to my lips. Then Pike and O'Banion staggered through the broken doorway. Or, rather, they were pushed. They were leaning against each other, faces unrecognizable masks of blood and swelling. O'Banion was missing teeth. Pike was clutching a shattered rib cage, weeping openly like a child. They collapsed onto the floor, joining Galt in a heap of defeated muscle. The saloon was dead silent. Even the air seemed to have stopped moving. Footsteps sounded on the boardwalk outside, slow, methodical, heavy. Silas Vance stepped through the ruined doorway. He was not gasping for breath. His shirt was untucked, and a cut on his cheekbone trickled a thin line of blood. But otherwise he looked like a man who had just finished a mild evening stroll. The terrifying stillness I had witnessed in the church was magnified 100-fold. He looked like a storm that had just decided to stop holding back its lightning. He paused, his slate-gray eyes scanning the frozen patrons of the Brass Horn. The men in the bar, hardened cowboys, gamblers, thieves, instinctively shrank back, pressing themselves against the walls. Wolves recognize a true apex predator when they see one. Vance reached into his pocket. My heart hammered against my ribs as I braced for a revolver. Instead, he pulled out a small white piece of cloth, a handkerchief. He slowly wrapped the handkerchief around his right hand, wiping the fresh blood from his raw knuckles. As he turned his hand, the dim saloon light caught the delicate embroidery in the corner of the cloth. A beautifully stitched letter C, Clara's handkerchief. He had carried a piece of her with him, and now he was using it to clean the blood of the men I had sent to destroy him. His eyes locked onto me, sitting in my shadowed booth. He dropped the bloody handkerchief onto Pike's chest. Without a word, he began to walk toward me. My mind screamed at me to stand, to summon the bartender, to assert my authority. I was Harlan Royce. I owned this town. But my body refused to obey. The sheer, suffocating menace radiating from Silas Vance pinned me to my leather seat. He stopped at my table. He looked down at the annulment paper resting next to my glass. Slowly, deliberately, his hand moved to his belt. There was a flash of silver so fast my eyes could barely track it. Thwack! The thick, heavy blade of a hunting knife drove through the center of my annulment document, burying itself 2 inches deep into the solid oak table, missing my fingers by a fraction of an inch. I flinched violently, knocking my bourbon glass over. The amber liquid spilled across the table, soaking into the paper, turning the ink into an illegible black smear around the silver blade. Vance leaned over the table. He was so close I could smell the dust, the sweat, and the coppery tang of fresh blood on him. "What's hers is mine," Vance whispered. His voice was a low, gravelly rasp that bypassed my ears and reverberated directly in my chest. It wasn't a threat. It was an absolute, immutable law of nature being explained to a fool. "You touch what is mine again, Royce, and I won't send your garbage back to you. I will come for you. And there isn't a hole deep enough in Texas for you to hide." I stared at the knife, pinning my ruined plan to the table. The handle was ornate, silver, wrapped in worn leather with a distinct crude etching of a soaring hawk on the pommel. My breath caught in my throat. I knew that crest. Every man with a bounty on his head from Kansas to the Rio Grande knew that crest. The Wraith, the ghost of the plains. A bounty hunter so ruthless, so entirely unyielding that men were known to ride into the nearest sheriff's office and hang themselves just to avoid being caught by him. He had disappeared a year ago after taking down the infamous Dalton gang single-handedly, leaving nothing but a pile of bodies and walking away from the reward money. I looked up from the knife into the slate-gray eyes of the man I had called a stray dog. "You," I choked out, my voice barely a whisper, all my manufactured superiority crumbling to ash. "You're Silas Vance, the hunter." A cold, grim shadow of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. It did not reach his eyes. "I'm Clara Sterling's husband," he corrected softly. "Remember that." He straightened up, pulled the knife from the wood with a sharp yank, slid it back into its sheath, and turned his back on me. He walked out of the saloon, stepping over the groaning bodies of my hired men without a second glance. I sat alone in the booth, staring at the gash in my table, my hands trembling violently. The script hadn't just burned. It had been butchered. I had wanted to trap a frightened girl. Instead, I had locked myself in a cage with a monster, and I had just poked him with a stick. Fear is a highly corrosive substance. It eats through logic, destroys pride, and, if left unchecked, dissolves the very foundation of a man's empire. For a week after the incident at the Brass Horn, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards in my grand house made me reach for the revolver in my nightstand. The knowledge that Silas, the Wraith Vance, was sleeping just a few miles away, tied to the woman I wanted by a pathetic copper ring, gnawed at my sanity. I could not use force. Force had resulted in 3 men requiring the town doctor's care for a fortnight. If I could not break his body, I would have to break her mind. The annual Oak Haven Autumn Ball presented the perfect battlefield. It was an event I funded entirely, held in the grand hall above the town's livery. It was the one night a year when the dusty, weary citizens of Oak Haven pretended to be civilized. I mandated attendance for anyone holding a loan with my bank, a subtle reminder of who held the strings. I ensured word reached the Sterling farm that their absence would be viewed as a breach of community trust, a clause I could legally manipulate to call in their debt early. They came. I stood on the elevated platform near the string quartet, a glass of champagne in my hand, watching the doors. When they entered, the room noticeably quieted. Clara looked breathtaking. She wasn't wearing the faded morning dress. Instead, she wore a simple, deep emerald gown that must have belonged to her mother. It was slightly out of fashion, lacking the heavy bustles of the current city styles, but it clung to her figure perfectly, bringing out the amber fire in her eyes. But it was the man beside her that drew the stares. Silas Vance in a suit was like a wolf forced into a dog's collar. He wore a dark tailored coat that stretched tightly across his broad shoulders. He looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes constantly scanning the room, assessing exits and threats. He never stood more than 6 inches from Clara. When they walked, his hand hovered near the small of her back, a phantom touch, claiming without grasping. I watched the way Clara looked at him. There was a softness there now, a tentative, blooming trust that made my stomach churn with bile. They were supposed to be pretending, but the flushed curve of her cheek when he leaned down to hear her speak over the music told a different story. I waited. A predator knows that patience is the sharpest weapon in his arsenal. An hour into the ball, Clara's glass was empty. Silas took it from her, nodding toward the punch bowl across the crowded floor. It was the first time they had separated all evening. As Silas waded through the sea of swirling dresses and dark suits, I made my move. I descended the stairs, gliding through the crowd like a shadow, intercepting Clara just as she stepped toward the open balcony doors to catch a breath of cool air. "A lovely evening, Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice smooth, dripping with fabricated warmth. Clara stiffened, her hand resting on the balcony railing. She turned to face me, her amber eyes hardening instantly. "Mr. Royce, if you are here to discuss the debt, you know the terms. We have until the first frost." "Business?" I placed a hand over my heart, feigning wounded innocence. "My dear Clara, tonight is for celebration. I merely came over because, because as the oldest friend of your late father, I feel a profound sense of duty toward your well-being." "You drove my father to an early grave," she said, her voice low and tight. "I am a banker, Clara. I enforce the rules of commerce. I do not make the world cruel. I merely navigate it." I took a step closer, lowering my voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "But the world is cruel, Clara, and it is filled with dangerous men. Men who wear masks." She frowned, glancing nervously over my shoulder toward the punch bowl. "I don't know what you're talking about. Excuse me." She tried to step past me, but I shifted, blocking her path just enough to trap her against the railing. "Do you know who you married, Clara?" I asked, injecting a note of desperate paternal concern into my tone. "Have you asked him where he comes from? How a man who claims to be a simple drifter manages to break a wild stallion with his bare hands? Or how he put 3 of the toughest men in this county in the infirmary last week?" I saw the flicker of surprise in her eyes. Silas hadn't told her about the saloon. Perfect. "He was defending himself," Clara said defensively, though her voice lacked its usual iron certainty. "Defending himself?" I scoffed softly. "Clara, you have tied yourself to a ghost. I made some inquiries via telegraph this week. Your husband is not a drifter. His name is Silas Vance. They call him the Wraith. He is a bounty hunter, a killer for hire. He has left a trail of blood from Missouri to the Mexican border." The color drained from Clara's face. She stared at me, her lips parting slightly. I pressed my advantage, twisting the knife of doubt deep into her chest. "Ask yourself, my dear clever girl, why would a man who makes a fortune hunting outlaws suddenly settle down in a dusty town, working for pennies, and marry a woman he has never met? Out of the goodness of his heart? Or because he made too many enemies and your isolated, failing farm provides the perfect, unassuming hideout?" I watched the poison work. I saw her mind racing, replaying every quiet moment, every secretive glance, reevaluating the man she thought she was coming to know. "He's using you, Clara," I whispered gently. "You are not a wife to him. You are cover. And when his enemies finally track him down, or when he simply gets bored, he will vanish into the night, leaving you with nothing but a ruined name and a farm stained with his bloody past." Tears sprang to her eyes, glistening in the lantern light. She looked shattered. She looked exactly the way I had wanted her to look since the day her father died. "That's enough." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the din of the ballroom like a scythe. I spun around. Silas stood 3 feet away. He held 2 crystal cups of punch, his slate-gray eyes locked on my face. The killing intent rolling off him was so palpable, I took a physical step backward, my cane slipping slightly on the polished floor. He didn't yell. He didn't spill a drop of the punch. He simply stepped between me and Clara, a solid wall of muscle and dark fabric completely cutting me off from her. He handed Clara her cup. She took it with a trembling hand, looking up at him, her eyes wide, searching his face for the killer I had just described. Silas didn't look at me. He completely, utterly ignored my existence. He looked down at Clara, and the lethal stillness evaporated. His expression softened, his jaw unclenching. He saw the tears in her eyes, and a flash of raw, unfiltered agony crossed his features. "The band is playing a waltz," Silas said, his voice entirely different now, gentle, deep, and meant only for her. "I'm not very good at it, but I'd like to try, if you'll have me." Clara hesitated. The poison was still in her veins. She looked at his hands, the large, calloused hands I had just told her were stained with blood. Silas didn't push. He didn't demand. He simply held out his hand, palm up, offering her the choice. "I am here," his posture said. "Decide." Slowly, Clara set her punch glass on the railing. She reached out, and her small fingers intertwined with his. Silas led her to the center of the dance floor. I stood by the balcony doors, my chest heaving with impotent rage, forced to watch my psychological warfare disintegrate in real time. He pulled her into his arms. He was stiff at first, unsure of his footing, but he held her as though she were made of spun glass. Clara looked up at him, her brow furrowed, undoubtedly asking him the questions I had planted. I saw his lips move. I saw him nod slowly, not denying whatever accusations she leveled at him. He was telling her the truth. And then I saw the exact moment she stopped caring about his past. Silas spun her gently. When she came back to face him, the distance between them vanished. She stepped into his frame, closing the respectable gap dictated by society. She rested her cheek against his chest, right over his heart. Silas closed his eyes, his large hand splaying across her back, pulling her impossibly closer, burying his face in her hair. They weren't dancing to the music anymore. They were simply holding on to each other, an island of absolute devotion in a sea of prying eyes. The raw, undeniable intimacy of the gesture was blinding. It was not a performance. It was a surrender. A murmur rippled through the ballroom. The townspeople were watching, their gossip dying on their lips, replaced by awe. I gripped my cane so hard my knuckles popped. I had tried to tell her he was a monster. I had tried to convince her he was using her. But as Silas Vance opened his eyes and looked across the dance floor directly at me, holding his wife against his heart, I knew the bitter truth. He wasn't hiding behind her. He was standing in front of her. And the game was no longer about a piece of land. It was a war for her soul, and I was losing. There is a distinct metallic taste to failure. It sat at the back of my throat for 3 days following the autumn ball. I had retreated to my estate on the hill overlooking Oakhaven, nursing my wounded pride with imported scotch and a simmering toxic rage. I had thrown my best weapon at Clara Sterling, the truth. I had exposed the monster hiding in her bed. I had expected her to flee, to run back to the safety of civilized society, or at the very least, to me. Instead, she had danced with him. But hope is a resilient weed, and I am nothing if not a meticulous gardener. I knew the human mind. A public display of solidarity was one thing. The quiet, suffocating isolation of a failing ranch was another. The poison I had dripped into her ear would not act instantly. It needed time to fester in the dark. She would look at his hands as he chopped wood and wonder how many men they had strangled. She would hear him pacing at night and wonder what ghosts kept him awake. I needed to watch it happen. By the fourth day, a brutal, suffocating heat wave descended on the valley, carrying with it the unmistakable yellow haze of a looming dust storm. The air felt heavy, charged with static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I rode out alone, leaving Miller and the rest of my sycophants behind. I tied my horse behind a ridge of limestone outcroppings that overlooked the Sterling Valley. From this vantage point, with the aid of a brass leather-bound spyglass, I had a perfect, unimpeded view of the farmhouse, the barn, and the dusty yard between them. The wind was beginning to pick up, whipping the tops of the brittle prairie grass. Through the circular lens of the spyglass, the world was magnified, silent, and intimate. I found them near the water trough. They were arguing. A surge of vicious triumph spiked in my chest. I pressed the brass eyepiece tighter against my face, holding my breath to steady the image. I could not hear the words, but the rigid angles of their bodies spoke volumes. Clara was standing near the porch steps, her arms crossed tight over her chest, her posture defensive and unyielding. Silas stood a few paces away. He was not towering over her or invading her space, but his hands were on his hips, his head bowed slightly as he spoke. Clara threw a hand out, gesturing wildly toward the open plains, then pointed a finger directly at his chest. I saw Silas flinch. It was a microscopic movement, a tightening of the jaw, but through the glass it was as clear as a gunshot. Yes, I thought, a manic smile stretching across my face. Fight. Let the rot consume the foundation. Tell him you know what he is. Tell him you fear him. Silas took a step toward her, his hand reaching out. Clara took a sharp step back. It was a magnificent sight. The invincible wraith, the man who had terrified the deadliest outlaws in the West, was being broken by the flinching retreat of a dirt-poor farm girl. He dropped his hand, his shoulders slumping in a display of utter defeat. He turned away from her and walked into the barn. Clara stood alone in the yard for a long moment, the wind whipping her skirts around her ankles, before she turned and disappeared into the house. I lowered the spyglass, laughing aloud into the rising wind. The sound was snatched away by the howling gale. The storm hit 10 minutes later. It came rolling off the plains like a solid wall of bruised, angry earth. The sun was blotted out, replaced by a suffocating, churning twilight. The wind screamed through the limestone rocks, pelting my coat with grit that stung like buckshot. I was forced to hunker down in the crevice of the rocks, pulling my bandana over my nose and mouth, closing my eyes against the blinding dust. The storm raged for 2 hours. It was a violent, chaotic purging of the earth, mirroring the violent fracturing I had just witnessed through my glass. I sat in the dirt, unbothered by the grime coating my expensive suit. I was elated. The storm would trap them inside together. The tension would boil over. By morning, Silas Vance would be gone, realizing that no amount of stubbornness could fix a woman who looked at him with terror. Eventually, the howling died down to a low, mournful whistle. The heavy, abrasive curtain of dust began to settle, leaving the world coated in a fine, rust-colored powder. The late afternoon sun broke through the haze, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. I stood up, shaking the dirt from my shoulders, and retrieved my spyglass. I aimed it back at the farmhouse, eager to see the aftermath, eager to see Vance saddling his horse to leave. I found the house. I adjusted the focus, and my heart stopped dead in my chest. They were on the front porch. The door to the house was wide open behind them, suggesting they had rushed out the moment the wind died. Silas was not saddling a horse. He was on his knees. He was kneeling on the dusty wooden floorboards of the porch, right in front of Clara, who was sitting in her father's old rocking chair. My hands began to tremble so violently, I had to brace the spyglass against the rock to keep the image steady. I watched as Silas, the killer, the apex predator, the man who refused to bend his neck to any authority, rested his large, scarred hands on Clara's knees. He was looking up at her. His face was stripped of all its cold armor. Through the glass, I could see the desperate, agonizing vulnerability etched into his features. He was speaking, his lips moving in a frantic, uncharacteristic rush of words. He wasn't explaining away his past. I knew that instantly. A man like that does not apologize for the blood on his hands. He only apologizes for bringing it into her home. Clara sat perfectly still, staring down at him. The defensive armor she had worn before the storm was gone. Then she moved. She didn't pull away. She reached out, her small, pale hands trembling slightly, and placed them on either side of his face. She brushed her thumbs across his cheekbones, wiping away the dust. It was a gesture of such profound, quiet absolution that it felt like a physical blow to my ribs. Silas closed his eyes and leaned his face heavily into her palms, letting out a breath that seemed to deflate his entire massive frame. He turned his head and pressed a long, lingering kiss into the center of her palm. Then Clara leaned forward. She slipped out of the rocking chair, dropping to her knees on the dusty floorboards right in front of him. There was no hesitation left. There was no distance. Silas's arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest, burying his face in the crook of her neck. Clara's arms locked around his shoulders, holding him as tightly as if the storm were still raging, and he was the only thing keeping her tethered to the earth. I watched them cling to each other in the golden, hazy aftermath of the dust storm. I watched the absolute, unbreakable fusion of two souls who had stopped pretending and started surviving, together. I lowered the spyglass. The brass cylinder felt heavy and cold in my hands. I had been a fool. I thought I was introducing a poison that would rot them from the inside. Instead, I had provided the catalyst. I had forced them to stop dancing around their arrangement. By trying to tear them apart with his dark past, I had only succeeded in proving to her that he was willing to lay down his darkest secrets at her feet. I had forged them in fire, and the resulting steel was infinitely stronger than the brittle arrangement they had started with. I turned away from the valley, the taste of failure now a bitter, suffocating ash in my mouth. Psychological warfare had failed. If I wanted Clara Sterling, and if I wanted that land, I could no longer rely on manipulating her heart. I had to rip the ground out from under their feet entirely. I had to use the one weapon that could not be fought with muscle, grit, or romance. I had to use the law. The law in Oakhaven was not a blind, impartial maiden holding a set of scales. It was a hungry dog that sat under my dining table, eating the scraps I chose to drop for it. I sat at my mahogany desk at the bank, the oil lamp burning low, illuminating the original deed and loan agreement signed by Thomas Sterling. I had read the document a dozen times, but tonight, driven by a cold, clinical desperation, I read it again, tracing every line of dense, legalistic text with my gold pen. Marriage had nullified the immediate eviction clause. That much was true. But a mortgage of that size, held by a bank with fiduciary responsibilities to its investors, which was just me, always contained safety nets. At 2 a.m., my pen stopped. I smiled. It was not a smile of amusement, but the baring of teeth. Section 4, paragraph C, the profitability clause. It stated, in convoluted legal jargon, that to maintain the loan in good standing, the property must demonstrate a minimum agricultural or livestock yield of $500 by the first day of the winter quarter, November 1st. If the land proved barren, mismanaged, or incapable of sustaining the debt, the bank retained the right to foreclose immediately to protect its investment, irrespective of the marital status of the deed holder. Today was October 28th. The first frost was already crisping the edges of the prairie grass. I knew the Sterling Farms ledger. I owned the feed store. I owned the depot. I knew that while Silas had repaired the fences and broken a horse, they had not sold $500 worth of cattle or crops. They were surviving, living day to day, planning for the spring. They had no spring. By noon the next day, I had assembled my execution squad. I did not send Miller. This required the full, terrifying weight of civic authority. I rode in a black buggy, accompanied by Judge Higgins, sweating profusely into his collar as usual, and Sheriff Tate, a man whose badge I had essentially purchased 5 years prior. The ride to the Sterling property was silent. The air was biting, hinting at the brutal winter to come. When my buggy rolled into the dusty yard, the scene was disgustingly domestic. Clara was on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, peeling potatoes into a tin bucket. Silas was near the barn, shirtless despite the chill, splitting heavy logs with a massive iron axe. At the sound of our arrival, Silas buried the axe head deep into the chopping block. He didn't rush. He simply picked up his shirt, wiped the sweat from his face, and walked slowly toward the porch to stand beside Clara. He didn't look at the sheriff or the judge. His slate-gray eyes locked onto me, cold and unblinking. I stepped down from the buggy, leaning heavily on my cane, savoring the moment. I walked to the edge of the porch, withdrawing the folded legal document from my breast pocket. "Good afternoon, Mr. and Mrs. Vance," I said, my voice crisp and professional. "A brisk day for chopping wood." Clara stood up, the tin bucket clattering slightly against the floorboards. "What do you want, Mr. Royce? The debt isn't due until the end of the year." "The principal sum, yes," I agreed, tapping the paper against my gloved hand. "But I'm afraid I am here concerning a different clause in your late father's contract. Judge Higgins, if you would be so kind as to explain the law to the young lady." The judge stepped forward, looking entirely miserable under Silas's dead stare. He cleared his throat. "Mrs. Vance, the contract stipulates that the property must yield a $500 profit by November 1st to prove its viability. We've checked the town records, the depot manifests, and the livestock registry. You haven't produced even $50 in taxable yield." Clara's face paled. She looked from the judge to me, her amber eyes wide with sudden dawning panic. We spent the summer repairing the infrastructure. My father let it go to ruin. We are preparing for the spring planting. You can see the work Silas has done." "The bank does not accept hard work as legal tender, Clara," I said softly, allowing a note of fake sympathy into my voice. "The clause is ironclad. If the land cannot produce, the bank must seize it to mitigate its losses." I held out the document. "This is a formal notice of foreclosure, signed by the judge, executed by the sheriff. You have until sundown tomorrow to vacate the premises." Clara swayed slightly. Silas reached out, his hand wrapping around her waist, anchoring her to his side. I waited for the explosion. I waited for the wraith to draw his knife, to threaten the sheriff, to do something violent and stupid that would allow Tate to shoot him down legally in the dirt. But Silas didn't move. A terrifying, chilling smile, the first true smile I had ever seen on his face, slowly spread across his scarred features. It was the smile of a predator that had just watched its prey walk voluntarily into a steel trap and pull the lever itself. "Profitability," Silas said, testing the word on his tongue. His gravelly voice was perfectly calm. $500 in yield to prove the land isn't barren." "That is the law, boy," Sheriff Tate barked, resting his hand on his gun belt. "I have a great respect for the law, Sheriff," Silas replied softly. He gently released Clara, turned, and walked into the farmhouse. I frowned, a prickle of unease scratching at the back of my neck. What was he doing? Going for a rifle? I glanced at Tate, nodding slightly. The sheriff unholstered his weapon, holding it down by his side. A moment later, Silas emerged. He wasn't holding a gun. He was holding a heavy, cream-colored cylinder of parchment sealed with dark red wax. It looked infinitely more official than the flimsy town documents Judge Higgins carried. Silas walked to the edge of the porch. He didn't look at the judge or the sheriff. He looked directly at me. He broke the wax seal with his thumb and unrolled the parchment. "I've been taking a lot of trips into town lately," Silas said, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "Sending a lot of telegraphs to the state capitol in Austin. Cost me a small fortune in wire fees." My stomach dropped. A cold sweat broke out along my spine. You see, Royce, my wife's farm sits on the lower branch of the Oakhaven River, Silas continued, pacing slowly along the porch. It's been dry all summer. But your massive estate, and those 3,000 head of prime Angus cattle you're so proud of, they sit on the upper branch. They drink deep. You dammed up the North Fork 3 years ago to ensure your herds never went thirsty, leaving this farm to dust. That is my right, I snapped, my voice suddenly tight. I own the land adjacent to the North Fork. You own the land, Silas corrected, his eyes gleaming with lethal amusement. But you didn't buy the water rights. You just assumed, because you own the town, that no one would challenge your diversion of a state waterway. The water rights for the North Fork were still technically unassigned public domain. He held up the parchment. I spent 5 years hunting the worst scum in the country. I never spent the bounty money. Didn't care for it. Until now. Silas stepped off the porch, walking until he was inches from my face. I could see the reflection of my own pale, terrified face in his eyes. This is a legally binding writ from the State Land Office in Austin, signed by the governor, Silas whispered. I bought the absolute exclusive riparian water rights to the entire upper and lower Oakhaven River, paid for it in cash. $10,000. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The wind stopped. My heart stopped. If you foreclose on this farm tomorrow, Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly, intimate hum, I will take this state writ. I will ride up to the North Fork, and I will legally dismantle your dams. I will divert every drop of water down into this valley. Within a week, your 3,000 cattle will die of thirst in the dirt. Your empire will rot in the sun. Judge Higgins made a choking sound. Sheriff Tate slowly, carefully slid his gun back into its holster, stepping away from me. They weren't fools. They knew who held the real power now. Silas leaned in, his breath warm against my cheek. The water rights on this property are now valued at $10,000, Silas said. Consider that our profitability yield, Royce. Now, get off my wife's land, and if I ever see your shadow cross this property line again, I will drown you in the river I own. I looked at Silas. I looked at Clara, who was staring at her husband with a mixture of shock, awe, and an all-consuming love that made me sick to my very soul. I had tried to break him. I had tried to outsmart him. Instead, the pawn I had laughed at had quietly walked across the board, and in one masterful stroke he had put the king in checkmate. Without a word, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my silver-tipped cane in the dirt. I turned and climbed blindly back into my buggy. The drive back to Oakhaven was the longest journey of my life, every jolt of the wheels sounding like the ticking clock of my own ruin. A man's empire is a fragile construct, held together not by stone or timber, but by the collective illusion of his untouchable power. Once that illusion is punctured, the collapse is not gradual. It is instantaneous and absolute. For 48 hours after Silas Vance unveiled that damning parchment on the porch of the Sterling farm, I watched my life's work bleed out. Word spreads in Oakhaven faster than a prairie fire. By the morning of the second day, the town knew that the drifter, the nobody, the ghost they called the Wraith, now held the state-sanctioned water rights to the entire river valley. The shift in the town's demeanor was palpable, and it was sickening. Men who usually tipped their hats to me now crossed the dusty street to avoid my gaze. The investors from Austin, who had backed my massive cattle operation, sent frantic telegraphs demanding reassurances I could not provide. My herd, 3,000 head of prime Angus, was entirely dependent on the damned North Fork. If Silas Vance chose to execute his legal right and dismantle those dams, my cattle would be dead within the week, and I would be utterly bankrupt. I would be worse than bankrupt. I would be a laughingstock. I paced the length of my cavernous library, the thick Persian rugs muffling my frantic footsteps. The walls, lined with leather-bound volumes of law and philosophy, suddenly felt like the bars of a cage. I had played the game of kings, and I had been outmaneuvered by a feral dog who had learned to read a map. I stopped in front of the grand fireplace, staring into the dying embers. A cold, crystalline logic began to distill in the chaos of my mind. Silas Vance held the water rights. That was a legal fact. But legal facts were only as permanent as the men who held them. If Silas were to suffer a sudden, tragic accident, if he were to perish, what would happen to that precious state writ? It would pass to his legal next of kin, to his widow, Clara. And Clara, without her fearsome protector, would be completely alone again. The water rights would be tied up in the bureaucratic nightmare of probate court for months. In the meantime, the bank, my bank, could seize the farm and all its assets to cover the original outstanding debt of $500. I could bury the water rights in legal red tape, maintain my dams, and finally, permanently, crush Clara Sterling beneath my heel. It was a brutal equation, but it balanced perfectly. I could not hire this done. Pike, Galt, and O'Banion were still nursing their shattered bones, and no other man in Oakhaven would dare raise a hand against the Wraith now. No, if you want a monster slain, you do not send a frightened villager. You must wield the blade yourself. I walked to the heavy oak cabinet in the corner of my study and unlocked it. Inside rested a custom-made Winchester lever-action rifle, its stock carved from polished walnut, its barrel gleaming with dark oil. It was a gentleman's weapon, meant for hunting elk in the high country, not for butchering men in the dirt. But tonight, it would serve its purpose. I retrieved a box of heavy-grain cartridges and began to load the weapon, the rhythmic snick-clack of the lever mechanism soothing my frayed nerves. I needed a distraction. I needed a way to draw the hunter out of his den, blind him, and leave him exposed. My eyes fell upon the brass kerosene lamp sitting on my desk. Fire, the great equalizer, the eternal devourer of both mansions and hovels alike. I summoned Miller to the study. When he entered, he looked nervous, his eyes darting to the rifle in my hands. "Miller," I said, my voice perfectly calm, entirely devoid of the frantic edge that had plagued me for 2 days. "Where is Deputy Higgins tonight?" He's at the saloon, boss. Sheriff Tate is sleeping it off in the jailhouse." "Why?" "I am going for a ride, Miller. A long, solitary ride to clear my head. I want you to go down to the saloon. Buy Deputy Higgins drinks until he cannot stand. Ensure the sheriff does not wake up. I do not want a single badge patrolling the southern road tonight. Do you understand me?" Miller swallowed hard, staring at the Winchester. "Mr. Royce, you ain't thinking of going after him, are you? The Wraith? He'll kill you, boss. He ain't normal." I stepped forward, grabbing Miller by the collar of his grimy shirt, pulling his face inches from mine. "I am Harlan Royce. I built this town from the dust up. I will not have it stolen from me by a stray who wandered in from the wasteland. Do your job, Miller, or I will ensure you hang for the rustling charges I've been keeping off your record. Am I clear?" Yes, boss. Clear." He scrambled out of the room. I was alone again. I changed out of my tailored suit, donning a dark woolen sweater, heavy riding trousers, and a black felt hat that cast a deep shadow over my face. From the carriage house, I retrieved 2 heavy iron canisters of pure, refined kerosene. The night was bitterly cold, the sky a vast, impenetrable canopy of black velvet, utterly devoid of moonlight. It was a killer's moon. I saddled my darkest horse and rode out of my estate, taking the winding, hidden trails that bypassed the main street of Oakhaven. The biting wind whipped at my face, numbing my cheeks, but the fire burning inside my chest kept me warm. As I approached the valley where the Sterling farm lay, I tied my horse in a thick grove of cottonwood trees a half-mile out. I would complete the journey on foot. The element of surprise was everything. I moved through the tall, dry prairie grass like a ghost, the heavy Winchester slung across my back, a canister of kerosene in each hand. The farmhouse was a dark, silent silhouette against the starlit sky. No lamps burned. They were asleep. I bypassed the house, my eyes fixed on the massive wooden structure of the barn. Inside were the sterling horses, including that demonic black stallion Silas had broken, along with all their winter feed and farming implements. It was the lifeblood of their survival. The plan was elegant in its savagery. I would douse the perimeter of the barn in kerosene and strike a match. The dry, aged timber would go up like a Roman candle. The screams of the trapped horses would awaken the house. Silas Vance, driven by his pathetic, newly acquired domestic instinct, would rush out of the front door to save the animals. He would be silhouetted against the roaring flames, a perfect, illuminated target. I would be waiting in the darkness, 50 yards away with a high-powered rifle. One shot to the chest. The wraith would fall, another casualty of the harsh frontier. The fire would be ruled a tragic accident, a stray ember from a lantern, a stroke of terrible luck. And I would ride back to my warm bed, the undisputed king of Oakhaven once more. I reached the shadowed wall of the barn. The smell of dry hay and horse manure filled my nostrils. My hands, surprisingly, were perfectly steady. I unscrewed the cap of the first canister and began to pour. The thick, pungent liquid splashed against the dry wood, soaking into the thirsty timber. I walked the entire perimeter of the barn, leaving a heavy, continuous trail of accelerant. You thought you could outsmart me, I thought, my mind whispering to the sleeping man inside the house. You thought paper and laws could protect you. But out here, in the dark, the law is written in blood. I emptied the second canister. I stepped back, the fumes of the kerosene making my eyes water. I unslung the Winchester from my shoulder, chambered around with a satisfying metallic click, and pulled a sulfur match from my pocket. It was time to burn the script and write the final chapter myself. I struck the match against the heel of my boot. The sudden flare of yellow light was blinding in the pitch-black night. I held the flame for a brief second, watching it dance, feeling the heat against my gloved thumb. I tossed it onto the soaked earth at the base of the barn wall. The reaction was instantaneous. A distinct whoosh tore through the quiet night as the kerosene caught. A ribbon of vibrant, hungry blue and orange fire raced along the perimeter of the barn, climbing the dry timber with terrifying speed. Within seconds, the entire eastern wall was a sheet of roaring flame, casting wild, leaping shadows across the dusty yard. I retreated instantly, running backward into the deep darkness of the tree line, 50 yards from the porch. I dropped to one knee, nestling the stock of the Winchester into my shoulder, and aimed the iron sights directly at the front door of the farmhouse. The horses inside the barn began to panic, their hooves kicking violently against the stalls, their high-pitched whinnies slicing through the roar of the fire. "Come out," I whispered, my finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Come out and play the hero, Silas." The front door of the farmhouse flew open. My heart leapt into my throat. I exhaled slowly, my finger squeezing the trigger, waiting for his massive silhouette to fill the frame of the doorway. But nobody stepped out. Instead, a profound, heavy thud shook the ground near the barn. Then another, and another. From the loft doors above the barn, massive, heavy objects were being hurled down directly onto the flames. I blinked, lowering the rifle a fraction of an inch, squinting through the smoke. They were sandbags. Dozens of them, dropped with pinpoint accuracy onto the base of the fire. At the exact same moment, thick, soaking, wet woolen blankets were thrown over the creeping flames on the walls. The roaring fire didn't spread. It choked. It sputtered, hissed violently as it fought the wet sand and wool, and within 30 seconds the massive inferno I had meticulously planned was reduced to a smoldering, foul-smelling line of white smoke. I froze, paralyzed by absolute confusion. How? The house had been dark. They couldn't have reacted this fast. They were prepared. They had been waiting. "Don't move, Royce." The voice did not come from the house. It came from the darkness directly to my left, no more than 10 feet away. I violently swung the Winchester toward the sound, a cry of panicked rage tearing from my throat. But I never had the chance to pull the trigger. A heavy, scarred hand materialized from the shadows, grabbing the searing, hot barrel of the rifle and ripping it from my grasp with bone-jarring force. The Winchester was casually tossed aside, clattering uselessly into the dirt. Silas Vance stepped out of the blackness. He wasn't wearing sleeping clothes. He was fully dressed in his dark duster, a Colt revolver strapped to his thigh and his silver-handled hunting knife gleaming at his hip. He looked like the very spirit of vengeance, his slate-gray eyes reflecting the dying, glowing embers of the failed fire. He didn't hit me. He simply stood over me, radiating a lethal, overwhelming gravity that pressed me down into the dirt. "You," I stammered, my mind completely short-circuiting. "You were in the house." "I haven't slept in the house for 2 nights," Silas said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "I've been sitting in the dark, waiting for you to finally lose your mind." Footsteps crunched on the gravel. From the direction of the porch, 3 figures walked out into the yard, illuminated by a pair of holding lanterns. Clara. And beside her, Sheriff Tate and Judge Higgins. I stared at the sheriff, the badge on his chest catching the lantern light. "Tate!" I screamed, finding my voice in my desperation. "Tate, arrest this man! He attacked me! I was walking—" "You were walking with 2 cans of kerosene and a rifle, Mr. Royce," Clara said. Her voice was not trembling. It was cold, clear, and ringing with absolute authority. She stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with her husband. The terrified girl I had tried to break was gone. In her place stood a queen protected by her knight. "I told them you would come," Clara continued, her amber eyes staring down at me with profound pity. "When Silas bought the water rights, he thought the war was over. But I know you, Harlan. I know your pride. I knew you couldn't stand the humiliation of being beaten legally. I knew you would try to burn us out." "It's a lie," I spat, scrambling backward on my hands and knees. "Tate, I own you. I pay your salary." Sheriff Tate looked profoundly uncomfortable, but he kept his hand firmly on his gun belt. "You used to pay my salary, Harlan. But $10,000 in state-backed water rights changes the economy of a town right quick. Mr. Vance here had a long chat with the town council yesterday. He offered to lease the water rights to the town at a fair rate, ensuring everybody survives the winter, on the condition that the law in Oakhaven actually starts acting like the law." Judge Higgins stepped forward holding a notepad. "Attempted arson of an occupied dwelling. Attempted murder. I am a witness. The sheriff is a witness. We watched you pour the oil, Harlan. We watched you strike the match." I looked around at their faces. The trap hadn't been set tonight. The trap had been set the moment Clara realized the depths of my depravity. She had used her own barn, her own livelihood, as bait. She had convinced the corrupt officials of this town that Silas Vance was a better investment than a decaying, desperate banker. I was not the hunter. I was a rat that had just been exterminated. Silas reached down, grabbing me by the collar of my heavy sweater, hauling me to my feet as easily as if I were a stray kitten. He pulled me close. I could smell the smoke and the cold night air on his skin. "I told you," Silas whispered, his voice for my ears only. "You touch what is mine, and I end you. I could have put a bullet in your head the moment you stepped onto this property. But Clara wanted you to rot in a cage, stripped of everything you think makes you a man. And I do whatever my wife asks." He shoved me backward, directly into the waiting arms of Sheriff Tate. The cold, heavy steel of handcuffs clicked shut around my wrists. The sound was deafening. It was the sound of my empire shattering into a million irreparable pieces. "Harlan Royce," Sheriff Tate said, his voice betraying a hint of genuine satisfaction. "You are under arrest. It's going to be a long ride to the state penitentiary." As Tate dragged me toward the road, where a prisoner transport wagon had been hidden in the trees, I looked back over my shoulder one last time. The smoke was clearing. Clara and Silas stood together in the yard. She turned to him, burying her face in his chest, the adrenaline finally giving way to relief. Silas wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her hair, holding her with a fierce, unbreakable devotion. They had won. Not with money, not with cruelty, but with an unyielding, terrifying love that I had entirely failed to calculate. The night swallowed me, and Harlan Royce was never heard from in Oakhaven again. Iron, I have learned, possesses a remarkable ability to hold the cold. It seeps into the bones, a constant physical reminder of the boundaries of one's existence. I stood by the narrow, barred window of the Oakhaven County Jail, my hands resting on the freezing iron bars, watching the morning sun bleed over the rooftops of the town I used to own. It was a crisp, clear morning in early April. 6 months had passed since the night of the fire. 6 months of trials, of sneering judges who had once eaten at my dining table, of former sycophants testifying against me to save their own worthless hides. The bank was gone, liquidated to pay the fines and restitution. The cattle empire was dissolved. Harlan Royce, the king of Oakhaven, had been reduced to prisoner number 4190, awaiting the 8 o'clock train that would transport me to the Huntsville State Penitentiary for a sentence of 20 years. At my age, it was a death sentence. The town below was waking up, entirely unbothered by my impending departure. The feed store was opening its doors. The blacksmith's hammer began its rhythmic clanging. They were moving on, thriving under the new, equitable water lease provided by the town's newest, most respected citizens. A pristine, freshly painted buckboard wagon turned the corner onto Main Street. I gripped the iron bars tighter, my knuckles turning stark white. It was pulled by a matched pair of healthy roans, their coats gleaming in the spring sunlight. But my eyes were not on the horses. They were fixed on the couple sitting on the bench seat, Silas and Clara Vance. They did not look like two desperate people clinging to a dying farm. They looked like royalty assessing their domain. Clara wore a dress of pale dove-gray wool, the fabric crisp and new. Her face was fuller, glowing with a profound, radiant health that only comes from absolute security and peace. And the man driving the wagon, I almost didn't recognize him. The ragged, exhausted drifter was entirely gone. The lethal, coiled tension of the wraith, the predator constantly waiting for an ambush, had vanished. Silas wore a finely tailored dark coat, his shoulders relaxed, his posture easy. He still possessed that undeniable, terrifying size and strength, but the coldness in his slate-gray eyes had been replaced by a deep, quiet warmth. He looked like a man who had finally put down a burden he had carried for a lifetime. Silas pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store directly across the street from the jailhouse. He secured the brake and hopped down with a fluid grace, turning to offer his hand to his wife. Clara took it, stepping down lightly. As she reached up with her other hand to adjust the brim of her hat, the morning sun caught a flash of brilliant, undeniable light on her left hand. I leaned my forehead against the cold iron, a bitter, hollow laugh rattling in my chest. The crude, sawed-off copper pipe was gone. In its place rested a thick, beautifully crafted band of solid gold. It was a permanent declaration, a trophy of their victory over me, and a symbol of the unbreakable fortress they had built together. I watched as Clara said something to him, laughing, a bright, genuine sound that drifted up to my cell window. Silas smiled. It wasn't the grim, mocking smirk he had given me. It was a real smile, wide and unguarded, transforming his scarred face into something almost handsome. He didn't step back when her boots hit the boardwalk. He stayed close, his hands resting naturally on her waist. He leaned down, and right there in the middle of Main Street for God and everyone in Oakhaven to see, he kissed her. It was not a desperate kiss, nor a show put on for an audience. It was a slow, deliberate kiss of absolute possession and profound reverence. It was the kiss of a man who knew exactly what he had, what it had cost him, and what he would destroy to keep it. Clara's hands rested flat against his chest, right over his heart, accepting the worship as her absolute right. When he finally pulled away, he rested his forehead against hers for a fleeting second, whispering something that made her eyes soften with a love so fierce it made me look away. I turned my back to the window, sliding down the rough stone wall until I hit the cold floor of the cell. In the distance, the low, mournful whistle of the Huntsville train echoed across the valley. It was coming for me. I closed my eyes, the image of that gold ring burning into the back of my eyelids. I had spent my entire life believing that money and fear were the only currencies that mattered. I had viewed human connection as a weakness to be exploited, a variable to be manipulated. When Clara Sterling had walked into that church with a ragged bounty hunter, I had scoffed. I had called it a cheap parlor trick. I had banked my entire empire on the certainty that it was a fragile, desperate lie. They agreed it was only pretend. That was the thought that haunted me now, echoing in the damp, lonely silence of my cell. They had written a script of convenience. I had tried to be the cruel director, forcing them to hit their marks and inevitably fail. But I had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the beast I had trapped her with. I thought I was locking a wolf in a cage with a sheep waiting for the inevitable slaughter. I did not realize that the wolf had been looking for a home, and the sheep possessed the heart of a lioness. The train whistle blew again, closer this time, accompanied by the heavy footsteps of the sheriff coming down the hall to collect me. I let out a long, shuddering breath, finally accepting the totality of my defeat. I had given her the ultimate ultimatum. I had forced her hand. I had built the stage, set the lights, and demanded they put on a play. They agreed it was only pretend. But nobody, not the law, not the town, and certainly not me, had warned her that the man she chose would forget how to stop. What started as survival became something stronger than fate itself. This channel brings stories of the Wild West, love, sacrifice, motherhood, and the quiet strength between people who refuse to give up on each other. The meaning of this story: sometimes love doesn't begin with passion. It begins with standing together when everything else falls apart. If you felt that journey, like, comment, share, and subscribe to follow more. This work is a creation of the author's imagination, designed to entertain and provoke thought. Any resemblance to real persons, places, or events is purely accidental. The author assumes no responsibility for interpretations that connect fictional elements to real-world entities.
When we look beyond the harsh setting of this story, the dust, the power struggles, and the cruelty, we discover that its true meaning lies not in land or wealth, but in the transformation of human hearts. At the beginning, Harlan Royce represents a man who believes everything in life can be calculated and controlled like numbers in a ledger. To him, people are weak, emotions are tools, and love is nothing more than leverage. He expects Clara to break under pressure, to surrender her land and her dignity. However, what he fails to understand is that strength does not always appear in the form he recognizes. Clara's decision to marry Silas is not born from love at first, but from necessity, a choice made to survive. Yet through shared hardship, quiet support, and mutual respect, something genuine begins to grow between them. This leads us to the first important lesson. Love does not always begin with passion. Sometimes it begins with standing together when everything else is falling apart. As the story unfolds, we see a clear contrast between two kinds of power. Royce uses fear, control, and manipulation, believing that dominance is the ultimate strength. In contrast, Silas represents a different kind of strength, one built on protection, responsibility, and loyalty. He does not control Clara. He stands beside her, supports her, and respects her choices. And it is precisely this difference that makes their bond unbreakable. The more Royce tries to destroy them, the stronger they become, revealing another key lesson. Arrogance blinds us, especially when we underestimate the human capacity for trust and resilience. In the end, Royce loses everything. Not because he is weak or foolish, but because he lacks humanity. He treats life like a transaction, while Clara and Silas build something real, something that cannot be bought or manipulated. The story reminds us that people are not numbers, and relationships are not contracts. True strength lies not in control, but in connection. And perhaps the most powerful message of all is this: love is not always something that appears suddenly and beautifully. Sometimes it is something that grows slowly, forged through hardship, trust, and the courage to stay.